Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, December 1st, 2024, and thank you for joining me while I talk to myself about another devastating Ohio State loss to Michigan. It was Ryan Day's fourth consecutive loss in this rivalry, as we well know. And it cost Ohio State a berth in the Big Ten title game for the fourth year in a row. Penn State, who the Buckeyes beat in Happy Valley on November 2nd, will happily take Ohio State's spot in that game. They will face number one Oregon next Saturday in Indianapolis at 8 p.m. Eastern for the Big Ten title. Oregon, by the way, had no trouble dispensing their rival, Washington, yesterday to create this matchup with Penn State in the Big Ten title game. This was a bed-shitting by Ryan Day and his staff of epic proportions. It was the worst bed-shitting in the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry in my 50 years of watching it. Even the most ardent of Ryan Day supporters, a group that is dwindling by the second, no doubt, cannot defend this loss. Michigan came into this game with 5 losses under its belt, which included double-digit losses to Illinois and Washington. As a 19.5-point underdog playing on the road, Michigan was severely undermanned yesterday. They were without the services of 2 of their best players, Will Johnson and Colston Loveland. And during the course of the game, they lost another, Donovan Edwards, to an injury in the second quarter. From an offensive perspective, Michigan's peers this season are the likes of Purdue, Stanford, Temple, and New Mexico State. I said this on our preview pod. Michigan came into this game in the high 100s nationally in almost every major offensive statistic, 128th nationally in total offense, 121st in offensive yards per play, 107th in scoring offense, 128th nationally in passing offense. Yet, Michigan managed to win this game with their starting quarterback throwing for 62 yards and 2 interceptions in the horseshoe against the nation's number one defense in Ohio State. Meanwhile, the Ohio State offense, loaded with elite skill talent, Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Carnell Tate, Trey Henderson, Quinshon Judkins. In the fourth quarter of a tie ball game, that unit produced a grand total of 10 yards of offense with 0 first downs and, of course, no points. At crunch time, in a must-win game with a conference title and a number one seed in the CFP on the line, Ryan Day and Chip Kelly gave you 10 total yards of offense, no first downs, and no points, Buckeye fans. Jeremiah Smith was not targeted in the fourth quarter of this game. Only 7 total targets for Smith, despite Michigan leaving him in one-on-one coverage most of the day. Now, Smith caught 5 of those targets for only 35 yards and a touchdown. Smith also drew 2 pass interference penalties in this game. He was criminally underutilized yesterday. It was coaching malpractice by Chip Kelly. Now, the Michigan defensive front had a clear advantage in the trenches against Ohio State's patchwork offensive line without Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin. This was a matchup I was concerned about in the preview pod, though I didn't think it would have cost Ohio State the game. And it was established very early in this game that that unit was not to be trifled with and that they would own the line of scrimmage. And yet that did not deter Chip Kelly from continuing to run fruitlessly into the teeth of that Michigan front. Only 77 rushing yards on 26 attempts for the Ohio State run game. It was a confounding choice by Chip Kelly to continue to run into the heart of the Michigan defense. Will Howard, who came into this game the country's leader in completion percentage and a dark horse Heisman candidate, had 2 more catastrophic turnovers in this game. Howard threw a terrible interception to Amir Hill deep in Ohio State territory in the second quarter. Hill returned it to the Ohio State 2-yard line, and that set up Michigan's only touchdown of the game. Howard threw another devastating interception from the Michigan 16-yard line in the third quarter to squander a promising scoring opportunity for the Buckeyes. Now, let's not forget, Howard made 2 similar mistakes against Penn State, but he lived to tell about those. He also had a red zone interception against Indiana last Saturday. And if you add all that up, you have to wonder at this stage where Howard's confidence is today and where the coaching staff's confidence in Howard is right now. I thought it was ironic, after 3 months in which Ohio State fans bagged on Kyle McCord and, praised Will Howard, that Howard made the same catastrophic mistake against Michigan that McCord did last year, handing them easy points after a terrible interception deep in Ohio State territory. Now, for most of the season, the Ohio State offense led the country in red zone touchdown percentage. They're still fourth nationally in that stat this morning. But yesterday, the Buckeye offense had 3 trips inside the Michigan 20-yard line that failed to produce any points. The Howard interception in the third quarter was one of them. The other 2 ended in missed field goal tries from Jaden Fielding from 38 and 34 yards. If Ohio State converts just one of those red zone trips into a touchdown, they win this fucking game. Now, the Ohio State special teams were awful yesterday, one mistake after another. They were dreadful in the kicking and return games. Now, late in the second quarter, Caleb Downs lost a Michigan punt in the sun, allowing the ball to hit the ground and roll 68 yards all the way down to the Ohio State 7-yard line. 3 plays later, Joe McGuire shanked his punt back to Michigan, giving the Wolverines the ball at the Ohio State 39-yard line. That allowed Michigan to kick a field goal to extend their lead to 10-3. And then at the start of the third quarter, Trey Henderson mishandled the opening kickoff, forcing the Buckeyes to start their first possession of the third quarter from their own 6-yard line. I mean, the strides the Ohio State special teams appeared to have made the last 3 weeks were nowhere to be found yesterday. Actually, it was a total regression to the Parker Fleming special teams of the last couple of years yesterday against Michigan. It was an unmitigated disaster for Ohio State special teams. Now, the Ohio State defense mostly held up its end of the bargain all day, but when the opponent holds the ball for over 13 minutes of the fourth quarter, as Michigan did yesterday, look, the defense is going to wear down. And I think that's likely what happened on the Khalil Mullings 27-yard run on third down that got Michigan into chip shot field goal range to win this game. The defense was just worn down. And otherwise, I thought the defense gave Ryan Day everything it had. I mean, they stopped Michigan twice inside the 10-yard line in this game. One was on downs at the beginning of the second quarter. The other was the Jack Sawyer interception from the Ohio State 3-yard line midway through the fourth quarter to end that scoring threat. In the third quarter, Caleb Downs gifted the Ohio State offense a first down at the Michigan 16-yard line after he picked a Davis Warren pass off of his shoestrings. It was a beautiful interception. I mean, the defense bailed the offense out time after time until they just had nothing left to give. Now, I have mostly defended Ryan Day for the last 3 seasons. He's a nice guy, and he's done some good things at Ohio State. Now, Will Howard's performance yesterday notwithstanding, Day has elevated the quarterback play at Ohio State to a level we had not previously seen at the program. He has mostly upheld the recruiting standard from the Urban Meyer era. He has had no off-the-field troubles with his program that would be embarrassing, to fans and to the administration, and he deserves credit for that. But look, the reality is Day has no accomplishments over the last 4 seasons that are commensurate with the resources at his disposal. That is a long time to go without any wins over his rival, without a Big Ten title, and without a CFP win. Day's last win over Michigan was actually 5 years ago in 2019. His last Big Ten championship and CFP win were in 2020. Now, the few remaining Ryan Day defenders will point to his overall winning percentage. Right now, he has the highest winning percentage of any active coach, including Kirby Smart at Georgia. But look, I'm sorry, that doesn't hold up for me. Because at Ohio State, there are 8 to 9 guaranteed wins built into the schedule every year. And while beating Penn State, Notre Dame isn't nothing. I mean, those games aren't easy to win. I understand that. Ryan Day's predecessors, John Cooper, Jim Tressel, and Urban Meyer, all dominated those games as well. I work with a guy who is actually one of the most knowledgeable Buckeye fans I know, and he asked me this morning, what if Georgia had fired Kirby Smart because of his record against Alabama, 4 or 5 years into his tenure? Now, Smart is 1-6 against the Tide in his career. Alabama is the one team that has had his number, and I do think it's an interesting point by my work friend as it relates to Day's record against Michigan. However, there are some pretty big differences between the two situations. Smart lost all but one of those 6 games to Alabama to the greatest college coach in history, Nick Saban, who, by the way, always had the more talented roster in that game. I mean, even this year's loss to Kalen DeBoer, Bama still had the more talented roster according to the 24/7 Sports Team Talent Composite. That has never been the case with Ryan Day against Michigan. Day has always had more talent to work with than Michigan in that matchup. And as good as Jim Harbaugh was at Michigan, he's not Nick Saban, not even close. And look, 2 of Day's losses to Michigan now have come at the hands of Sherrone Moore. And I'm going to go out on a limb right now and say Moore is also no Nick Saban, okay? And despite the dismal record against Alabama, Smart is 5-1 in the CFP with 2 national titles. Ryan Day, over that same span, is 1-3 in the CFP with no titles. So those are 2 major differences. Right? Ryan Day has not been coaching against Nick Saban in the Michigan rivalry, and he does not have 2 national titles to his credit like Kirby Smart. So I just can't buy that comparison right now. Doug Lesmerises made an interesting point on Subtext yesterday. He said, quote, OSU has 2 separate paths in this era. Beat Michigan on one path, do the things necessary to chase and win a national title on the other path. They can intersect, but they aren't close to the same thing. I'd say both paths are equally important, and OSU should be good at both. Day is not the guy for the Michigan path. Could he still be the guy for the Natty path? Maybe, but I would say it's Natty or bust for Day's job. Ross Bjork has to ask himself if Day is the best guy available to beat Michigan. That answer is no. But if Day completes the Natty path, that's reaching one of 2 goals. But 0 for 2, probably it, end quote. Now, look, I mostly agree with Doug, though I do wonder if making the national title game might be just enough. At this point, Day can't do anything to silence his critics over his failures against Michigan. And look, that verdict, as Lesmerises has said, is already in. We have 4 years of evidence to support it. But he still has a shot to show he can win a true matchup game in a playoff setting. That's another area that has dogged Ryan Day in his career. And now I'm not talking about a first-round win over Boise State or Arizona State, right? That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is beating the likes of Oregon, Georgia, and or Texas. Now, without knowing what the bracket is going to look like, I think Day would have to beat a minimum of 2 of those teams, Oregon, Georgia, and or Texas, on his way to the title game in order to keep his job. If he can do that in this new playoff format, then I think he has a compelling case to keep his job. Now, I wouldn't bet a dime right now on that happening, but it is, at the very least in theory, possible. I think Day's in a really tough spot. A new president, a new AD, neither of which have any loyalty to him. As I mentioned, he has no accomplishments to point to over the last 4 seasons that are commensurate with the resources he's been given. And look, what are those resources, right? A $20 million NIL roster, reportedly, though I tend to think it's probably more than that. The best prep player in America in Jeremiah Smith. The best player available in the transfer portal, Caleb Downs. A blank check to hire pretty much any assistant he wants, including his mentor, Chip Kelly, who was a fucking disaster yesterday. And meanwhile, Mike Vrabel is just 120 miles up the I-71 twiddling his thumbs as an overqualified analyst for the Browns. Man, to me, it looks like Day is on extremely thin ice right now. So here the Buckeyes are again for the 4th season in a row, sitting at home on championship week. This time they'll be watching newcomer Oregon play a team Ohio State already beat Penn State for the Big Ten title. It's another bitter pill for Ohio State fans to swallow, but the season isn't over yet. There is still a glimmer of hope thanks to the 12-team playoff, which is Ryan Day's only saving grace right now. Just as an aside, I want to address a post I saw from SEC honk Peter Burns of ESPN on this topic, on the topic of the 12-team playoff. Burns said, quote, Ohio State versus Michigan was the first time all season that I felt the expanded CFB playoff took away from the regular season. In a 4-team playoff, the game is everything, and he uses the all caps for everything. While it was an epic upset, it didn't feel as cataclysmic as it would in years past, end quote. Now, first, to me, this is evidence that many people in and around college football are total fucking sadists, and they've always been. I mean, why would you want this result to be more cataclysmic for anyone? I mean, losing that game in the fashion that they did was plenty bad enough for Ohio State. But then in the immediate aftermath, Columbus cops used pepper spray on Ohio State players to break up a fight with Michigan players who were trying to plant their flag at midfield again. I mean, that wasn't cataclysmic enough for you, Peter? How about the earth swallowing the horseshoe? Would that have been enough? I've just never understood the mentality by a lot of folks in college football, a lot of old school people especially, that we should expect absolute perfection from college kids, or they should suffer the most dire consequences imaginable to their season. Go fuck yourself, Peter Burns, from the South Stands, sincerely. Now, much to Peter's chagrin, Ohio State is a lock for the playoff and probably a lock to host a first-round playoff game. I don't think they're going to drop below the 8th seed, though we will see. I personally don't think Ryan Day has the chops to run the table in the CFP. That would entail beating 4 of the 12 best teams in the country inside of a month. I think the defense is probably good enough to do it. But, again, I'm gravely concerned about Ryan Day's ability to coach Ohio State through it. I'm gravely concerned about Will Howard's confidence right now after what transpired yesterday, after the mistakes that he's made in big moments, both against Penn State and in Indiana and some other games. He made some mistakes against Oregon as well. I'm also concerned about the play of the offensive line. That should be, a major concern, because no doubt the Buckeyes are going to face other teams with NFL defensive lines in the CFP, like a Georgia, like an Oregon, that can replicate what Michigan did to them yesterday. Now, the Buckeyes will not play until Friday, December 20th or Saturday, December 21st, in a game that'll be played on a college campus, either in the Horseshoe or on the campus of their opponent. We will know Ohio State's playoff date and opponent by this time next Sunday, and then I'll plan to wrangle Paige and Chad for a preview of that game at some point in the next couple of weeks. Okay, that's going to do it for me. Now, you might hear from us again before the playoff pairings are announced if Paige and Chad think they need to vent their frustrations over this Michigan loss, before we can dive into Ohio State's playoff opponents. So watch your feeds for that. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.